Good evening, everyone. This is Just Fine with 2MK. Today I will be joined by Rillian. So we are going over GBot in our disc guidance segment. And to start things off, we're going to take a look at the CPU first to go over why the bot is a bit different from the CPU, and later on we'll discuss how the bot is structured and all that good stuff.
We can already easily see that the main issue with the CPU version of this character is that for most opposing characters it doesn't really handle the skill feeling, and it doesn't always handle certain aspects of the character's neutral game. If you really want to get a feel for G as a character, it's not too bad to go up against the CPU for a while. You'll definitely get to see some of the things it does. But as always, you find yourself facing the fact that CPU can, first of all, read your inputs, secondly, space itself perfectly, and thirdly, there are certain things it can do executionally that are next to impossible for a human to pull off in the time frames possible.
Which is really not the best of things to test out for the content level that we're aiming for certain.
But above all, it's because if you set the CPU to levels lower than 7, it makes some very strange and relatively useless mistakes. Mistakes that a player would generally not make. And if you set it higher than that, it doesn't make enough mistakes of any kind, really. It just tends to get hit when you happen to move before it does. Or when it jumps, which it does a surprising amount of time for a character that is generally so good at controlling neutral. But as GBot is one of our advanced bots, we're going to assume that most people who have gotten to the point of wanting to use it can already anti-air most situations and don't really need more help with that. He's good if you want to get good and used to G's jump in buttons, but other than that, he's a little lackluster, especially if you start to play defensively. As usual, our bots are less focused on managing to hurt you and more focused on teaching you things that would help you against players who make standard mistakes or have certain repetitive tendencies, usually based on what is perceived to be the strength of the character. But with all this jumping, more or less the G CPU comes down to, can you stay out of one particular spot on screen, and can you anti-air? So, of course, if you want to practice those things, please use the CPU. However, a character like this often uses different tools and tends to be dealt with more so by rift punishing. And above all else, we're realizing that if you jump at him, he generally doesn't respond in the way you expect, at least not from most players. Even when set to his higher levels, if you jump at G, he basically doesn't do anything. He can anti-air occasionally, but it's usually rather lackluster and tends to be pressed a bit early so that he's just kind of sticking out a button that you happen to land on, more so than specifically anti-airing.
I think he was only anti-aired me once, and it was with his crouch, like, medium punch or something. So definitely more of the variety we're talking about of landing on a button.
We obviously can't make a bot able to anti-air, but that's not really the point, because the main thing we understand about G as a character is his V skill is a really good solution for a lot of things. So, we can utilize the same concept of you happening to land on an attack that anti-airs, but let's use a better one. Overall, the use of V skill by the CPU seems a little lackluster. And furthermore, the use of the presidentiality gauge really doesn't seem to come out too much. Uses it to confirm into big damage, but that doesn't tell you anything about how to fight people who use it to try to open you up and so on. Occasionally you will see him use the V skill, but we wanted more than that. So, we'll show off a little of our GBot for contrast. We did show a little bit on Wednesday's stream, but now it's going to be more focused directly on them. And we'll go into the inputs later on, in maybe about 10 minutes or so. What we will mention at least a bit now though, to explain why it's important, is the point system. We did again mention this on Wednesday also, but I'll cover that a little bit for you while Just Fine demonstrates the point system in question. Our expectation, first of all, is that when you're facing people, they will be trying to build up his presidentiality level as much as possible. And while it may seem really obvious, we'll just knock him down and it makes it go away, not everything we do is actually a knockdown, and for certain characters it can actually be fairly limiting that you must use your knockdowns to remove his stuff. A lot of the best combos in the game do knock down cleanly, but there are a lot of other good resets and so on that you could get used to using, which may not lead directly into knockdowns, meaning that if you get defended correctly, you're faced off with G at a powered up level. G's built up presidentiality is powerful enough that you have to care. He has some moves that change their frame data drastically, and others that chain and become more powerful in specific ways. Generally, you'll see the bot demonstrate G's higher levels of presidentiality primarily in its V trigger state, and we suggest using V trigger 1 for this. But he will still manage to build it up sometimes. However, he doesn't do it that often, which is important when it comes to the rest of the point system. Since you cannot easily get all of your points by just waiting him out, waiting until he builds up such a bar, meter, whatever you want to call it, and then knocking him down. You do have to try to get some other points in other ways. One of the more powerful techniques we've seen used is if G is spaced perfectly, his spin kick is effectively not punishable for a certain set of characters. Quite a large set of characters for that matter. G's spin kick, if spaced correctly, cannot be hit because it is only -5 and he's usually far enough away that you do not have a move that will reach without either taking a fairly large risk, in that if you did it at the wrong timing, it was probably a 4-frame move, relatively unsafe, moved rather far forward, and so on. But even if you could hit with the 5-frame move, you sometimes don't get to continue your combo properly, which is much more important in this case. Since you are aiming not to necessarily counter hit but to punish, not being able to reach with the second hit might mean that you might not be able to get the knockdown in question. However, fortunately for you, or relatively unfortunately for you, it doesn't even matter, since if G has any presidentiality at all, that spin kick is no longer punishable. It becomes a -2 move, and when spaced properly, it's even more of a nightmare to deal with. Our effort, therefore, was to give the bot a rhythm and a sense of flow that tends to lead toward him having that specific range for the wheel kick, either because he's pushed you out, or because you didn't want to stand that close to begin with for various reasons. Most of this is achieved through the overhead and long heavy kicks he uses, but he has some other options. Overall though, the aim was to make it so that when you wanted to move in on him, you had to think about certain things. And his attacks were generally intended to push you back out to the point where all of his moves become spaced more safely. We expect that at the levels in question that we are trying to teach him for, your opponents will make some mistakes in that spacing, or you will be able to move in an unexpected way and end up blocking their attack closer than they expected, but from there you have to be able to capitalize on it. So that is the point in question. You are aiming to punish G's spin kick when he doesn't have enough presidentiality to make it a threat in terms of you not being able to punish it at all. And by watching his spacing to recognize whether or not you can. For some characters, their EX moves make this more possible, and for others, they just have to do the hard work. Another move we expect to see a lot of use is his sweep, countering heavy kick, but only after certain specific actions and at certain specific spaces. We expect that usually he will be merely whiffing it, and a lot of the timings of the bot have been set up relative to that. However, since you are often going to be spending your time trying to walk closer to him, it increases the chances that you'll be clipped by this move as you move in. If you don't jump at him constantly, which is no help to you as it gains you no points. In fact, specifically, if you are going to remove his presidentiality level and get the point that way, you must get in on him without jumping. That is the requirement. So this sweep is something we expect to see used because of its range, the general popularity of that style of attack at certain levels of play, and just the unfamiliarity of the character and his options, making it a little bit easier to stick it out without people thinking too much about whether or not it's a good idea. Once he is spaced properly, it becomes a dangerous move to deal with. Fortunately, the rhythm required to do this put him in about the same place as we wanted for the wheel kick, meaning that it just became something that he could use without too much stress. If you want to stand really close to him instead, you have to deal with, even though it is slow, his constant attempts to command grab, coupled with his relatively strong pushback, forcing you from the defensive side to just stay in a particular position. However, you can get at least one other point in the bot from being that close. Specifically, his G burst, his projectile attack, is -6, then he has no presidentiality. Technically it's different when he has it, but that's more so because of how far away he pushes you. And that means that if you are close enough to him and he does this move, even after one hit, it's one specific hit, but it's still after one hit, you will be able to punish this similar to the wheel kick, well, the spin kick. If you cannot punish it, he's still in a position where, having very few invincible style moves, you're still able to treat it the way our Kata 22 has taught, specifically to use probably your standing medium kick. As he cannot really start any attacks of his own, that won't get stopped by that medium kick for most characters, as most characters have standing medium kicks of either 8 or 9 frames. This is of course much more useful if your standing medium kick happens to be quite long range, and you're generally looking for anything to fill in that space if you don't have such a long range stand medium kick. So with the combination of those 4 points, you can understand what the goal is. Therefore, let's go into the inputs required to get this bot set up and working. GBot's action 1 is reasonably simple, but it's not so easy to input, as it is very fast. You see here we have a pulled version. This could be done just as easily with a triple punch button, but if you either don't feel like setting one or just don't tend to do it that way and feel like you can do it, don't want to mess with your config, whatever, it really makes no difference if you do this. You're looking to hit a triple punch, followed very quickly by a throw input, followed by a very fast quarter circle input, and end immediately. If you do this fast enough, the game will actually treat the 2 down inputs as consecutive enough to count as G-charge, which means that he will G-cancel out of burst and he will have EX G burst as the standard thing. You will nearly never see the throw. It's more so there so that he can tech throws and occasionally try to grab you and poke at him, rather than having to worry about anything else. As with most such inputs, this comes into play more so alongside others, so let's move on to Action 2. GBot's Action 2 is about making sure that he can do his lunging attack. But in this case, he uses his V skill to set up the command grab. So this one is not specifically the lunging attack in itself, just required so that it makes sense. The command grab requirement is so that he can dash up, make your life miserable with it, and so on. This by itself does not do that, as it does start with his V skill input, and as a result, does not actually normally do the command grab. There is one condition under which you can get into, but you're not really aiming to get him to do the command grab from this input. It is a V skill followed by either a double or triple kick. Normally it comes out as double because you were effectively plinking from the V skill input, so the medium kick still counts as held down. Then you can do these both from neutral and very quickly enter a dash, an up forward input, and then a full half circle back in order to unlock the command throw. It's reasonably simple, but is again quite fast, and therefore you might have to practice it a little bit to make sure you don't get too many extra inputs in it or anything strange that you can't really get anything out of. His Action 3, however, is where we start to see some of the things that will create the parts of the bot you're more expecting. This is similar to our Sagat bot input style, and as a result somewhat difficult to do. It is a very quick down, then down forward medium punch. This medium punch is then held until the end of the input. But G specifically does this and then does another quarter circle forward. He has to go to down back or something similar in there. He has a slight delay in which he can do it, but you don't really care if you get too close to a quote-unquote uppercut motion, because this is intended to give him his lunge. The specifics of keeping the V skill input at the beginning of the other one is related to this. This is why you must hold that medium punch, to make sure that occasionally it can come out as a kick when moving from one input to another. The medium punch version of his lunge is decent, and therefore we decided it was fine to keep in. In certain other situations, this can end up coming out as just a medium punch. And interact with the other parts of the bot so that he can get more things, as always. It is also good for his jump-ins as G crosses up with a down medium punch input. He specifically must hit down or some down direction along with his medium punch in order to get the cross-up style jumping attack that you are now seeing. While it's not hitting here, it should be timed so that it generally does. This is not too difficult to do, given that you tend to take up the entire time of the jump with the half circle back motion, meaning that he doesn't have too many problems with this most of the time. So, turning off both of those, we'll go back to looking at action 4 now. GBot's action 4 is about getting the kicks involved for both his smash under and for his EX command grab. This is also where we have gotten at least one of his sweep inputs. In this case, it is similar to action 3. It is a down, down, forward input, and it can be quite difficult if you're not used to it. Down, down, forward, medium kick, plus heavy kick. From there, the rest of the input is actually fairly easy. You just go back to down back, hit medium punch, hit the skill, and generally you can hold it, but it doesn't really matter that much to do. We suggest holding it for other reasons. The down back aspect of this allows him to block at least some of the time. And the other inputs add to him at times where you're pestering him overall, or when certain of his moves recover with certain timings. It also, of course, allows him to do his jumping heavy kick as needed. And in conjunction with certain other actions, he will be able to do his smash under attack. Usually, of course, it will be EX smash under. This is fine either way, as GBot does not have full meter all the time. And so it will always be ES. You'll get some time to look at some other ways of it working, but this input very seldom leads to that specific output, so you shouldn't worry too much about it if your bot doesn't actually do that. You don't really care too much. You should definitely try to make sure it is a down input though, so that you get the sweep, and therefore you might as well try to get it completely correct. Finally, GBot's action 5 is where we get all that V-trigger action and the launch attacks for the Gaia Sphere that come from the V-trigger. It also allows us to get quite a few command normals, but it's slightly hard to input for that reason. This involves a total of at least 3, if not 4, V-trigger inputs. 4 is preferred, by far, to the point where we don't actually show on the page that we would accept 3, but if you can only manage 3, you might be able to play the bot with it fine. Since we can't be sure of that just yet, we will not add that to acceptable or similar. The input here is stand like kick, very quickly hit stand V-trigger, forward V-trigger, back V-trigger, down, down V-trigger. It's important that you hit the down not as a single input, but that you tap down twice in order to do this, and that you end the recording very quickly once you've done that. Basically trying to hit the V-trigger button, and nearly instantly after that, hitting the ending recording. This is to allow for more cancels and Gaia charges, and to help him pull off certain moves from certain timings that would otherwise be difficult. He's able to use the V-trigger to set up the V-skill and throw out the launchers either way. But when his V-trigger is up or is not available, these become basic command normals and sweep inputs. Note that there are no points involved in punishing message to the people, and there are no strange setups in which we have held enough buttons to have him keep talking. However, we will demonstrate somewhat what happens with the combination of action 5 and action 3 to clarify one point about it. Note that the light kick here is where the spin kick comes from. Note further that that spin kick by nature is then followed by heavy kick or command normals. Meaning that G has the potential to spend a lot of time poking at you and making you comfortable at various spaces, and then throwing this out. Because of the spacing involved, this often means that he is capable of doing things that are related to timing that don't outright make sense here. This is because if you held the medium punch correctly, when you release it, or when the game considers you to have released it at the end of the action, the last action where you could have gone to the spin kick, there are moments when he will do G-burst instead. It's unclear exactly what is causing this, but understand that this is usually, if not always, a negative edged version of G-burst, and therefore not so easily replicated unless you were quick about it and actually did hold that medium punch until the end of the input. This is therefore has the potential to change later if certain moves have priority over others, and we can't directly guarantee that it will remain exactly the same, but for now, it is much better to have this in so that he can throw this even when he is not doing anything that appears directly connected to his G-burst. If you find that yours cannot do this, however, don't stress about it too much. You might want to look into how your action 3 has been recorded. There shouldn't be too many, if any, problems with action 5 that are capable of causing that to not happen at all. So, having spent approximately our usual time covering inputs, let's look into various strategies and potential pitfalls in terms of approach to this bot.
So, as Rillian had noted earlier in the stream, if you want to move in on G, you have to be ready for various things. As you can see, the bot is fairly heavy in terms of taking actions. There's not a lot of waiting. So he's a very busy man, as the president of the Earth should be. But there's not always going to be something happening, as you can see. Timings for like doing a speech or recovery on B skills, etc. allow you to move in. Where I have been noticing one can run into some trouble is if you don't have a plan, which we mentioned on our Wednesday stream, and that you have to go in there and do something, or you're gonna get hit, or you're gonna get thrown. But if you just rush in and say hit medium punch, right, that doesn't get you any points. It just gives G V-meter, and more importantly, it can prevent him from doing his presidentiality or his spin kick or any of the actual things that give you points. So it's not always useful to do so, unless of course he already has presidentiality, in which case getting that knockdown is sort of the point. but make sure you know why you want to go in on G. He's very dangerous up close, and he has a lot of ways up close to take a lot of your health. Like, for example, he does a lot of white damage, which a command throw, if you're staying up close to him, can just rid you of right away. This is some of the ways he slowly over time can erode your health. And given the amount of damage his command throws do if you keep staying next to him, it's not very easy. So part of my strategy so far is to not necessarily want to be anywhere in particular. The bot itself will figure out where it wants to be, just as your opponent will. He has a lot of long buttons and ways to push you back, which is why the bot is useful to train. But I find it more important to know exactly where you want to be doing when he puts you out of space. For example, I know that if I'm close enough for him to sweep me, I'm probably going to be able to punish his wheel kick if it happens. And that if I'm out of range of his wheel kick, I'm out of range of his command grab, which is pretty good, because again, it does damage, it knocks you down, and it gives him control of the spacing. But it puts you out of range for everything else. However, the bot does sort of need time to charge up his presidentiality, and as you can see, if he has his B meter on, he doesn't charge presidentiality, and he basically does nothing you can really get points for other than the sweep. But being able to punish the sweep is a fairly risky prospect when he has the much safer versions of his moves, which put him next to you and therefore conveniently command grabbable. So you need to be careful. In fact, I have found the less I do against this particular character, the more successful I tend to be, because I'm not sticking out buttons for him to command grab. The bot is very good at doing this. Lots of command grab characters are able to use your sticking out buttons to their advantage. So, it's something good to get used to in terms of what a grappler is capable of. But again, to get your points, you will have to eventually stay close. Because there's, at the slightly further range, you can still get that wheel kick. A little closer, you can get the fireball, and a little further away from the wheel kick range, you can still punish sweep. At least on Mika. But there's no real advantage of me attacking the bot until right now, where he got presidentiality. So now he gets his V-gauge, and he'll eventually cancel it. And I'll have to survive G, more or less, until then, and be on the lookout for that sweep. All the while, not getting command grabbed, walking backwards safely, since that dragon kick move he can do hits low, which I've seen quite a few people do online. So even though this bot doesn't do it often, definitely something that you want to keep an eye out for.
It was actually one of the specific things that I added to it, realizing that most people could probably manage to think, oh, let me just block low. But after getting hit by his projectile and being pushed back, most of us want to either come forward again or shift back out again. This is why you'll see him start to cancel his G burst into that move fairly often when he has his V trigger up. Because that's the confusion. You're already caught in the pushback from his max power G burst. You're thinking about what is coming next, and suddenly what is coming next is G using smash under at your knees. It seems simplistic, and in fact it is. It's relatively simplistic to just realize what's going on and like, not get hit by that move. But you do still have to learn it. There is still a muscle memory component to it that you really want going into matches against a character you're not likely to see too often. Especially since once he is in that state, if he does hit you with it, he can get into big damage from there. So you really want to make sure that your opponent is at disadvantage for trying that, rather than even thinking that this is a good idea.
Also, staying in the corner with this bot is an experience. Especially when he has V-Trigger active, it's really difficult to deal with. G as a character is able to, like Bison's V-Trigger, or V-Reversal, sorry, hit from all sides. And when you're trying to get out of the corner, that is not a very friendly thing to deal with, since it knocks you down, does some damage, and puts him at the spacing advantage in terms of controlling what happens next.
G can then hop over you or use his massive amounts of corner carry. And when he is in V-Trigger, there is a delay in terms of how he changes his direction, but so far we have seen some signs. If you try to jump over his head and get clipped by his V-skill, there is a potential situation where he can delay the launch of the ball long enough to make it go in the direction you got hit in. Fortunately for you, this does not normally hit you unless you got hit really high by his V-skill, but we've basically confirmed this is possible, and you really don't want to get caught by it because then he'll just carry you all the way to the other corner.
So overall, basics-wise, keeping track of how much V-meter G has and how risky it is to do a punish relative to that, what his presidentiality is like, and what his V meter, or his CA meter is at to suddenly do those low lunging attacks is fairly important in terms of determining how much you can retreat, what you need to be ready for in terms of, okay, do I need to jump for a little bit here? Do I need to slowly inch my way out? It's fairly intense for something that is more or less fairly simple.
But rather than try to demonstrate that on a character who has really good options for moving forward as punishes and such constantly, we're going to switch to Ed, who has much harder time not dealing with G as a whole necessarily, but if Ed tries to use too much of his own mobility, G starts to dominate the match, which is interesting because you would think the opposite, that G would generally want to be on the defensive against Ed, who has all of these longer lunging options that can keep up with it, but the way that their hitboxes interact tend to leave Ed at more of a disadvantage than we expected at the first. And of course, while Ed's zoning is strong against characters who are going to have their but we also get some shifts. When they are actually trying to interact with each other at closer range with projectiles. This is related to, firstly, the fact that Ed does not necessarily do too well in close range zoning, but it's also related to the fact that when G uses his attack, Ed's zone does not collide with it in the way you expect to normally.
And as you see, because it hits the ground, it will trade. At the very least.
This is regardless of whether or not Ed also uses CPEX, mind you. Somehow it just tends to go through and they both get hit. Which isn't really that disadvantageous to Ed, but if you were looking to make sure that G couldn't clip you in certain situations, you're really out of luck there. Fortunately, Ed has a lot of projectile invincible moves, a lot of good long space normals if he's not trying to combo, and a good backdash to deal with when G is getting too close to him. The backdash being the main part of Ed's mobility that you would want to use, but even then not too often. Because if you get red on the backdash, G will generally convert into big damage. While the bot does not obviously manage too much in terms of having a proper fireball wall with you, or deflecting your zoning with its key skill, we're going to assume that anyone who is playing that situation against you with Ed already understands at least somewhat what is going to happen or why it is going to happen the way it is, and doesn't need a bot to teach them too much about it. Since you know you can't win the zoning war at max range anyway, even if you employ it, it's not likely to be your main tactic, and therefore you're going to need some of this. And if you are not a person like Justine who generally just automatically defends from overheads, G's overhead kick can make your life really miserable.
To be fair, I do that because they really annoy me.
But we have a lot of characters to go through and I'm not going to spend too long on each one. However, I will leave it to her to give her input as an Ed player on how to approach this before we move on.
Overall, the zoning seems to be useful when G is in V-trigger. because you can essentially stop G from doing stuff and waste his meter during it. But other than that, Ed has to be extremely patient and very careful with where he's standing, since Ed doesn't have that many good options in terms of far-spaced moves for doing punishes. So it's certainly good for grinding out your Ed combos, it's good for your awareness, and honestly, it's good for building your patience. Since a lot of the time, Ed really shouldn't just be doing anything or figuring out how to escape, since unless he has presidentiality or no CA meter, it's generally safer for Ed to just not do anything and stand at a space where he can possibly punish the sweep while waiting for G to build up presidentiality. So that's mostly my take on it.
We're moving to the character who has basically the entirely opposite approach to this matchup, and that being Ibuki. Ibuki more or less wants to be doing something all the time. She has more vectors of attack. She has more ways around G's normals and approaches. She has better, clearly spaced attacks to deal with certain situations. And kunai, while they can still be absorbed / reflected, they really don't have the same rhythm or feeling as things like Cycle Spark. On the other hand, Ibuki's range for some of the punishes required of this bot really isn't as good, and some of her better confirms are basically locked off by any G player who knows where to stand. However, knowing that almost everything that G cancels into is either an advancing move or a relatively slower move means that it's a bit easier for Ibuki to feel freer with her command dashes, as long as she's not too concerned with them actually leading to anything. Trying to pin him down with command dashes is much harder than just using them to get out of the way of things. She can generally wait and control the situation after the dash once they're both resituated, rather than trying to make sure that she gets into the right position to hit him, because there's so many things G can do in response to her trying to get to that spot that it's just problematic for her. She wants to go entirely past him most of the time when she uses her command dash, normally as expectation from something else she thinks he will do. This is further helped by the fact that G has a lot of relatively slower normals that you can't necessarily get close enough to him to do anything about if you were already spaced out. But Ibuki can just somewhat bypass if she's ready early enough, or just intends to do something beforehand. With other characters, you're waiting until you have reached the point of your hit or your point of your advancement where you can land your hit on G. And you generally feel, well, if I'm this far away, I need to walk in to get into range. Ibuki just command dashes through, and if G happened to be doing something, this is pure advantage to her. When she finds herself too far out to be assured of that, her V skill covers a lot more of this situation than you think. Unless, of course, you're an Ibuki player and know how well her V skill covers nearly everything. So again, while she can't necessarily punish him for doing things, if she expects him to stick out buttons in order to keep her from entering a certain space, it acts as a good whiff punish and a very clean knockdown to deal with a lot of his power-up situations, and to get advantage from the knockdown required in order to keep up pressure herself. So she basically doesn't need to play the spacing game with G more or less at all if she's willing to be a little daring about command dashing through, using her V skill, and so on. G in turn will then have to slow down to be ready for those things, meaning that she then can just slide or walk up or dash up or overhead, wherever she wants at that point, because the opponent is no longer just keeping her out with buttons that take up space in front of her. The bot does not showcase the medium kick that G has available, which is probably one of his best options in that situation. But this is also because Ibuki can really just run into that kick however much she wanted, or even with punish it with kunai for reasonably big damage, especially if she has EX meter to do her conversions with. But generally you can see it demonstrated as her being able to use the command dash, the long strikes from her V skill and her heavy punch. Her little hop, which has some weird properties interacting with his G burst at certain timings, for example. And just generally knowing that G can't necessarily combo into things, but will respace himself in order to then hit the next button. It really doesn't matter if you're not there anymore, which is what Ibuki specializes in. That said, getting points on the bot is a different matter. Because if you assume that the opponent has managed to space her out correctly and is generally quick enough that you don't really feel comfortable doing her command dash or similar, her ranges, in conjunction with G's general stances that he places, make it really hard for her to get good, strong punishes on most of the things he does.
I missed it. Step aside. Now stand up.
You're quite limited to either misspaced wheel kicks or trying to find a way to make him whiff his sweep. And if she's far enough out that he whiffed his sweep in a natural fashion, she's probably not getting a good punish off that.
I missed it.
So there are quite a few characters for whom this is true, but this is particularly true for characters with poor backdashes, because they have to tend to stand further away from G in the first place, so as to be safe from particular things. Meaning that when they do backdash out, and he tries to sweep, they tend to not be in a good position for punishes. Characters with long backdashes can afford to stand closer to G and make him uncomfortable, just outside his command grab range, for example. meaning that if he tries to advance on them, he's less safe. But if he just wants to try to grab them or do other things of that nature, they can just backdash out and be reasonably far away, so that if he does anything right away, he will often live. You'll see a bit more of this problem show up later when we look at Cody. But that's more toward the end of our stream. And we'll be moving to a character who actually does have quite a good backdash, relatively, and much longer poking buttons, as well as some ways around G that, while not as consistent, definitely can make his life miserable still. We are speaking of Jury in this case. Jury's strong ability to convert from clipping with normals decently far out, her ability to whiff punish on certain ones, and the ability to go over a lot of projectiles with her Ryodan Satsu mean that while this is not really an easy matchup for her, given her lighter hitboxes and tendency to run into G stuff, if you can play a reactive game against them, it's very likely to come out in your favor, especially since at full screen, Jury basically only has to worry about two things G does. And while G himself may not need to worry about Jury at that range, it's much easier for her to get the life lead and keep it than it is for him.
I missed it. Step aside. Now stand up. Now I missed it. I missed it. Step aside. I missed it. Shut up. Now I missed it. Now stand up.
Fortunately for G, while Jury does have quite long range on her normals, they still don't quite match his. Meaning that if they decided to play purely footsies, then he'd probably still win out. The problem is that Jury will eventually get meter, or manage to charge Flurry. And her meter is much more dangerous than his. She's also a character in the relatively unique position of being able to charge her V skill, expect and see G's lunges coming, and cancel the V skill with the backdash to evade them. Once she has her V skill available, a lot of G's options aren't as good anymore, and he is relegated to basically going in or trying to perfectly time it so that he deals with her. But a fully charged one hits both coming and going, meaning that he can't use the same timing for both things. If Jury makes him flinch though, she has at least 3 ways to reach him very quickly. including just usually delaying the same Z skill.
I missed it.
Our general advice of playing against Jury therefore applies to G also, and it's semi-unintentionally added to GBot. One of the easier ways to deal with Jury stuff is to move toward her suddenly and then do something unexpected. This is because a lot of her moves are optimized only when she's reacting fully. But she can't afford to let you get spacing control or position, so she has to try to react to your approach. If she does it correctly, great, but if you do something that will change where your current boss is likely to be, or in the case of grappler characters, outright grab her extended limb, she can end up in some strange situations.
If you do play Jury and have not had much practice in terms of backdashing against pressure characters and figuring out when to retreat, if you have difficulty with that, this bot is probably a prerequisite, in my opinion, before you go off and do some of our katas that focus around dash timings and stuff. So, if you can't afford GBot, there are some other options, but if you already have the president for some reason, he's a fairly good option for this. Also, it helps in terms of getting experience with someone who does have as long of buttons as you in a little better, that isn't some oversized brute like Birdie or Abigail. He's a fairly thin fellow, and it can make the spacings feel a little more challenging like Urian usually feels.
Step aside. Did you like that?
Add to that the fact that, unlike nearly every other character of his type in the game, that really long character, you're guarding your legs a lot of the time with the same smash under mentioned before, which isn't actually something to build up. You may find yourself lacking slightly because we're so used to larger characters like this being characters against whom we guard from the air because they're usually given leaps, stomps, things like that. And when they do go for things on the ground, those things are usually very unsafe for them, so they don't want to overuse them. I won't necessarily say that G players out there are going to be clamoring to try to hit Jury with Smash Under, but I'm fairly certain that they're going to be more willing to do so than Bison sliding at her, for example. However, Jury is a character who normally spends a lot of time standing and getting ready to do things from standing, so you have to be a little more on your toes with Jury. Because if you just start swinging at each other in neutral that way, you're going to get clipped eventually.
Especially with Jury's lighter hitboxes. I haven't been having as much trouble feeling-wise against GBot, or and G in general, with Jury when it comes to her hitboxes, but there are definitely situations where it still comes up even in this matchup. I will say though that if you really like your V skill and you want to figure out how to actually use it, this might also be a good bot for training that as well. Since while you won't necessarily get points on the things in question, your ability to learn which direction to dash in, since you can dash forward and back, is going to be able to be trained depending on where G moves and where you want to be. But also, you can gradually learn your timings in terms of dealing with the Dragon Punch and Dragon Kick, as Rillian was mentioning earlier.
I missed it.
With more traditional fireball users, I'd say it's a little too easy to use V skill to solve the problem if you have it charged up. But use GBot as an opportunity to learn when to charge it and how you want to cancel out of it to save your charge.
It's being particularly true because, as mentioned, whereas other fireball users normally care a lot more, they're trying to get a specific situation set up, they're trying to zone in a specific way. G has multiple options to do this, and basically screen crossing lunging attacks if you really wanted to deal with you doing this too much. So don't count on him staying still and trying to hit you with his projectile, or dashing up, like trying to cross the screen that way. He's definitely a character who can put things in places where you would expect other characters to have to move in on you really visibly, really obviously. G doesn't have to do this. Sometimes he moves forward just to bait you into thinking it's time to attack, and then do something else altogether. And it doesn't help that he can reach half across the screen with his spin kick as well. It's the unsafe version to do with this, but he can still do it. But speaking of reaching halfway to nearly all across the screen with a single attack, it's Cammy's turn. One might expect that Cammy would have a relatively straightforward game plan against this character. And unfortunately, based on what we've learned so far, you'd be very wrong. While pressuring G doesn't seem as if it's particularly difficult, his V reversal is interestingly effective in a lot of situations. And his backdash, while terrible, does seem to make it just far enough that it's not just ridiculously easy. The bot, however, will not backdash. We did not enter any backdashes, and you're not really trying to pressure him in the first place. You can try it out to get used to it. Cammy's bigger problem is actually that she will tend to put herself naturally at spaces where G has advantage. And when she's not doing this, it's because she's susceptible to his V skill. Most characters, once they've pushed themselves out to a certain level, have to wait for Cammy's next mix-up, more or less. G does not seem to have to wait. And at Matt's range, she finds a lot of his stuff more difficult to punish than would initially be obvious. His sweep in particular can stress her out at Matt's range. Because while she can use certain things to get the hit, these are not the things you're used to hitting, and they're not usually leading into too much. Similarly, since Cammy players are often more likely to feel comfortable on the offensive, if they face a G player that ends up being the one on offense, understanding all of his spaces well enough to be sure of themselves might take some practice, and that is what this bot is intended to help. It's always problematic for Cammy players who face a character who can make them defend and then suddenly manage to dash in and actually reach them to do something. Because Cammy wants to take up a very specific space, and G is happy to let her take up that very specific space. Because unlike most characters, that space is just within the range of most of G's normals. So it's really not that Cammy can't be where she wants to, it's that she's in more danger there than she is against most other characters. If you play Cammy in the more generally popular pressure style, you should find G a relatively easy character to deal with. If your Cammy play is based more around her footsies, fishing for that knockdown to then put on the pressure and maybe bait them, maybe not, you'll be a little bit harder to deal with because your instincts won't match up as easily to what you need to do. It pushes you out, gives you the feeling that you should try to get back into that sweet spot that Cammy likes to stand at for most other characters, and it will no longer be a good spot for her to be at. Therefore, it's actually better if you're playing against GBot with Cammy to take more advantage of knockdowns than you technically would if you were just going for points. But be careful about going for throws on those knockdowns, as he can not only tech them, even the bot can tech them, but the spacing after the throw tech for G is relatively advantageous to him. And with 900 health, then G does manage to get started. Cammy tends to be ended soon after. What you should probably do, however, is at least make sure not to attack when you strongly believe that a player would have defended in that instance. We will probably make some modified versions of GBot eventually, with more defense. As is relatively limited in it now. But do note that there are certainly times where you will know it's really obvious that if it were a player, they would have been able to block, and it would have been a good idea for them to block. They wouldn't have even needed to hit a button. Those are the moments you're looking to make sure you don't take quote-unquote advantage of when you shouldn't. In terms of actually getting points against the bot, however, you can see that it can end up being difficult for her because of the spacings we have mentioned earlier. Therefore, while you are doing that, even while you are giving yourself some free attack rounds, pay really close attention to where G makes you end up standing or crouching after you get pushed out. Particularly when he has active presidentiality or high levels of CA gauge to use on things like EX triggers. You don't want to get overcommitted or too frantic, since mostly she can defend her way through things and wait for that perfect moment to confirm into a knockdown and put him into patented cannon pressure from there. Doing that from the underconfident perspective of pushing too hard is likely to end up being frustrating, and if G does have enough meter to confirm into big damage, lead to real problems. She's also a character who, if you miss certain punishes, won't get her knockdown. For the most part, she'll be fine. But making sure you get the knockdown against G quickly takes quite a lot of risk. And her various dive kick timings, well, not only does he have a really long range on his V skill, it's relatively hard to bait it up in a way that would cause him to really suffer for doing it. That said, he doesn't have a lot of great normals for anti-airing or stopping dive kicks if they are done at perfect height or spacing. So we're definitely not discouraging you from using these as an option. Just make sure that the G player doesn't expect it too much. They're not exactly a tool to be used in pure neutral in this matchup. Or, if you want to make sure to use them most effectively, try to make sure you use them up until G has his laser and then stop. This type of meter watching is quite important for a lot of characters going up against him. There are things he can do really successfully until he has V-meter. And then you'd want to stop doing those things almost immediately. Even if he hasn't actually activated it. Because you may end up giving him the opportunity to do so. And you really don't want to give him that opportunity when he's able to convert it into upwards of 400 damage. Like Rainbow Miki, he's also relatively difficult to whiff punish as a character. And his height can be a little bit weird for certain interactions that can have. But other than that, you can more or less play your standard game plan, just pay very close attention to your spacing on the ground. Since if you autopilot the range that most of us know from other characters, you're going to be in some trouble. And speaking of characters who have to worry about their spacing, especially if they don't have a good backdash, it is in fact now Cody's turn.
I am the world president.
Cody faces three main problems against G, even if you discount Cody's relatively poor backdash. The first is that he is himself a relatively footsie-oriented character focused around with punishes and so on. And while he does have the tools to do this against G, he doesn't necessarily have the tools to do it against G's offense. The second problem is his strong tendency to space himself in places where he really can't do much against it. But Cody's third problem is by far the biggest. His crouch medium kick does not cancel into anything. And while he absolutely can use his light ruffian kick in a lot of similar situations, the difference in startup and with punish capacity of that move really limit what he can do when G is messing around in certain forms of neutral. Basically, any character that has to spend too much time waiting for G to get into a particular position might be waiting nearly forever. He's a patient man.
Cody does have the advantage of having a lot of buttons that are combos that knock down, though. So he has to worry a little less about that. So from the combo side for Cody, mostly look out for what kind of advantage you're going to get from it spacing-wise. Since obviously, in order to get any points at all, you need to be somewhat close to G. But this backdash, as Brilliant was noting earlier, really not the best. Doesn't really get you out of sweep at some other ranges some other characters could possibly get away with. Keeps you in a range where you could get jumped in on and still have to deal with his air pressure. So Cody is a man who has to more so deal with G's advances and the encroaching world government, so to speak.
Another thing that will become very important for you is that, unlike most other characters, Cody's most basic combos, the combos you probably learned just, you know, get used to playing the character, don't really work on G very well. Cody has a lot more strictness about how close the opponent has to be in order for some of his combos to work. Stricter even than Ed. It's not that Cody's combos are inconsistent, as Ed's were before, but simply that you know they don't work. It's just that what else are you going to do? Fortunately, G's moves are slow enough that if your reactions are really good, you can use Cody's specials and command normals, or mostly just hammer kicks, to deal with a lot of things. And if you're not too worried about presidentiality, because he doesn't have it yet, or because you just feel you have a big enough advantage over your opponent, you could just play standard footsies with like his medium kick and not worry about it at all. Just slowly chip your opponent down. It's when G has presidentiality and is managing to keep you out that Cody has problems.
I think
Until you're fairly practiced, you'll have problems doing with punish level reactions while still trying to maintain the correct spaces.
I think from a Cody player standpoint, learning what zonk to hold and such is very important for all characters and like a basis of Cody. But against G in particular, while it depends a little bit on your opponent, it is a good whiff punish for some of G stuff. And it results in a knockdown. So if you are focusing on the presidentiality point, that's generally where you can learn that. Also, Cody's main anti-airs tend to do okay. You don't always need the V skill to solve the problem. Because while G has a lot of control in the footsie's range, Cody is still, if he's not trying to advance too much, can maintain a fairly decent range for where he only has to worry about heavy punchable air attacks or just ignoring it because it's V skill.
As for punishing Sweep, Cody has nearly no problems, as he has his own extremely long sweep along with myriad options for just dealing with that almost immediately. Therefore, we'd suggest focusing a lot more on what happens when you get pushed out by V-skill or when you need to deal with spin kick timing, because Cody punishing Sweep has never really worked. It might not do the max damage you'd like, but it's not really difficult. Though he does, like nearly every other character, have a range at which he can't just hit his own sweep against G. In most situations like that, you still have some good options, and depending on which V-trigger you're using, and if you happen to be in V-trigger at the time, you may have really good options. Since Cody can tend to stand right outside the space where G's sweep will actually hit, and still do a decent job of punishing it. And even if not with punishing it, getting into a space that G can't deal with as easily while being safe. Heat is not really something we expect to see a lot of from the G side in this matchup.
But as you can see, G can push back Cody quite a bit forward. So while you do want to be mindful of how much V-meter G builds, sometimes that stand medium kick is worth the closeness to V-trigger, just in terms of being able to maintain a little more control of your own spacing to actually get the points and not have to always be focused on your exit strategy.
However, we do have one character for whom hitting stand medium kick is really not a great strategy in this matchup, which is kind of sad given that it's such a great strategy in every other matchup. Kareen's situation against G is not necessarily difficult, but it is a little complex if you're used to playing her a particular way. Everything still works, they just all work at different times than you're used to.
missed it. What can you stop this?
Kareen's issue comes from the fact that the way her hitboxes interact with G's position is often a negative. She fortunately is able to stay closer than most characters, but it does mean if the opponent decides to do anything really risky and wins out, she takes way more damage than she's probably managed to deal to them with all that poking. Furthermore, Kareen generally needs to hold control of space by putting attacks into that space, which she is phenomenally good at dealing with. He moves around attacks, he extends strong punishing spaces toward those attacks, and he has a good set of command normals to make that even more difficult. Meaning that you could get tempted to play Kareen a little bit more aggressively than would probably be a good idea against his character.
I missed it.
What eventually happens is a large deficit of meter between the two, without the corresponding relatively large deficit in health. She is a standard health and standard stun character, meaning that Kareen, with her 900 health, is already at a huge disadvantage in just terms of trading and footsies before she begins. The fact that his metered moves do more for him in this matchup than hers tend to do for her just makes the whole situation worse. Fortunately, she's able to keep him from getting much, if any, presidentiality, given the number of knockdowns she's able to confirm into from really long ranges. Meaning that she mostly has to care about when his V-trigger activates. It is fairly long lasting though, and not so easy to just wait out. If he takes any actions in terms of moves, it does deplete, but he really doesn't have to if he's managed to be intimidating enough. Since most of his play at this point is not really about putting pressure on Kareen or chipping away at her in terms of grey health that he does to other characters, but rather moving to very precise positions or being daring with his own moves. And since his V-meter, his V-trigger state, effectively takes over from his regular meter, meaning that he can get most of the same effects without actually needing to use CA gauge, any gauge he builds up during that state is effectively a smaller extension to the sort of strong, safe attacks that Kareen has to deal with while it's up. Depending on your reaction, you can be fairly safe in a lot of situations, but if she has managed to run out of meter or generally been repressed somehow, reacting to G's dash up command throw is actually a little harder to do. despite the fact that the command throw itself is super slow relative to most. This is because Karin's ability to anti-air G is even less than it is for most other characters. Meaning she has to constantly be on the lookout for G just deciding to jump. His ability to just hang in the air isn't necessarily as helpful against a patient enough Karin. But depending on where and how he times that skill activation in the air, he may be able to not only get the jump in, but effectively, due to the delay before it works, whiff punish her anti-air attack. Since she tends to extend her attacks very far into it, without necessarily going with a big follow through like a Shoryuken, that would have a chance at least of reaching the floating G before anything happened. If she wants that, she has to once again go back to using meter and slowly building up his advantage. As you can see, it means that she spends a lot of time waiting, standing still, and not necessarily at G's mercy, but whenever the player in question would realize, okay, it's about that time where you think you're going to be able to come in after me. I used a regular move of this kind, I didn't space this absolutely perfectly, whatever. They can simply activate some metered option to increase the mental stress. It's in Karin's favor, therefore, to finish this as quickly as she can, taking advantage of his relatively weaker defense. So similar to Canon, if you're training against GBot as Karin, we suggest, if you do get a knockdown, play it out. Go for the meteors, go for the attacks, just to feel how the match should actually feel once you've gotten it. Try not to make yourself too frantic, but you can't do a whole lot on wake up that really bothers her. That said, he can defend, and given his life difference from her, he can choose to just take the throw, which is going to be one of the important things. So that is one of our other suggestions. If you are going to be facing this situation and getting knockdowns with Karin, or Canon for that matter, don't go for pressure, because a good G player could eventually get out of it, or decide that they're willing to use the V reversal to get out of it because they'll win out in neutral or whatever. Therefore, your better bet is to either go for pressure into throw or straight for throw after the knockdown. Get used to what happens when you do that, and it will help you at least somewhat. While our GBot does not generally do a lot of quick dives or back rolls, he does do it occasionally. And being clear on where he ends up relative to that with those two characters whose throws are not so good for pressure really. Might help you in real matches more so, and it isn't too hard to add that into your bot experience. To close out our stream, we will talk about a character who has much less trouble, even considering that one of their throws is basically full screen, because of their ability to manipulate their air approaches more heavily than G can deal with easily. We saw some of this on Wednesday, but we're closing out with the Dictator.
City in chaos. Bison. Why, thank you. I am the world president.
And using it to give a final demonstration of things you can learn from this bot. As Justine will probably be giving more insight onto the stranger interactions between these two that she's observed over the last couple of days of pulling at GBot.
I missed it.
When G manages to get up close to you, he's able to do the V skill and some other attacks, which can result in a knockdown. This is actually technically towards your benefit depending on what side of the screen you are and how close to the center you are. Bison doesn't really benefit too much from being that close to G. And if he gets pushed out, he doesn't really mind either. Bison has a very long with punishes. So escaping the command throw might be a little less costly in terms of your life. If he has V-Trigger on though, all bets are off and just don't even bother. You'll find yourself using some less standard, longer options against G. And if he has presidentiality, you may find it advantageous to figure out when you can use your heavy kick to keep him from approaching you, as you can usually get some sort of knockdown after it, as long as you're not too far away. And if it crush counters, all the better. As I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, you honestly benefit a bit more by being quiet. G seems to have at least animations that you would expect to result in hitting you on standard characters. But they just don't. They feel very close to his form in that sense, although not all of them are. But still, a lot of his normals tend to be. Learning when to stand is therefore sort of important. We've talked a lot about how G attacks her legs a lot, and how this allows you to train when to crouch and how to back off safely. But depending on what kind of flow he's in, you really can just stand there. I mean, you don't have to do anything. And Bison in particular, while he does like his charge moves, a lot of stuff G does can be parried. And once you get the fireball, you have a free knockdown. So, at least from the presidentiality point, Bison has a fairly easy time. And he also has a fairly easy time keeping G out when he's in V-trigger form, compared to some other characters. You don't really need your meter to keep G out, since he'll push you out for you. And once you get to a certain range, burst, your medium kick, your heavy kick, they all start doing their standard job. So really, from Bison's side, it's just learning when it's safe to backdash so you don't get thrown. Keeping your charge, however, does let you get a bit more damage off when he does his spin kick, for example. The only real way to get decent damage or a possible knockdown is through your charge moves. However, like we've been constantly pointing out, his command grab is fairly long. And if for some reason the G doesn't use projectiles too often, Bison can usually space his slide against G in a way that G can't really punish it too hard for. This gives you yet another way to whiff punish from afar and make the G a little more hesitant.
I missed it.
And with that, we've basically come to the end of our stream. It's been a little longer than most of our disc guidance because of the complexity of the character relative to what the bot does specifically. And given the fact that the bot was already released and this is just covering it for all those people who need a bit more information on what it was we intended when we were making it, especially if they want to make any modifications or just didn't understand how to use this particular character. Of course, if you have such questions or realize that the bot acts weirdly for your particular character, you can contact us from our contact page at our website 2-mk.org. And of course, if you want to have access to the bot, in case you did not get everything from the inputs mentioned in the stream or just need a reference point, you can find it at 2-mk.org/bots. G is in the advanced bots section. Next week the team has the tournament Shine on that weekend, hanging out with the Smash scene in the smaller SF5 tournament. Hopefully lots of casual matches. Next week Monday we will be having our Mishmashing Battle Lounge as usual, and we should be having the Tuesday train for Guilty Gear. Wednesday is a bit iffier, but we may still get some content of some kind. Most likely not Street Fighter. However, Thursday is people flying out, and therefore there will be no Kame House lobby next week. And most likely no Friday content either. We're not expecting to have Monday content, but we may have something. It's possible that we will have a smaller mishmashing lounge, given that not everyone has to actually travel in order to participate in tournament question. And then we'll be back to relatively normal with all our reports from said casual matches and so on. Starting back on the Tuesday of that week with more Tuesday training and back to our usual from there on. Therefore look forward to that as well as our Dragon Ball Fighters bots or bot, depending on whether or not I come up with anything else that we can do in the upcoming weeks. And of course, feel free to join us for all our lounges, whether they be beginner or intermediate, especially if you need just like some spotting or experience with characters that you know us to play. Tonight there is apparently no stream from the Balance Patch gathering of the New England FGC. We had heard that there are some minor issues with the stream there tonight. However, if this changes, we will be hosting that as well, probably. That said, this has been Lillian.
And just fine. Signing
out.
out.
Wish you a good night and happy training.